civil liberties versus civil rights. Remember the civil rights, think of U.S. history, Martin Luther King. Civil liberties, we're talking about Bill of Rights and the things that you are protected from. This is more about discrimination. When is it okay for them to treat you differently because of who you are? And when is it unconstitutional? And that's really the focus. And we've already talked about a lot of different types and classifications of discrimination. And as we go through, the biggest thing to remember is that the way the government views them is different based on when the discrimination occurs and what is the standard they use in order to decide whether the treatment is constitutional or not. And that really is broken down by the different categories. So to begin, we'll focus on African Americans, just looking at the impact that they have had with civil rights. Now, you go back to the Fugitive Slave Clause with the Dred Scott decision. When a slave leaves the South, do they become free? And no, it was ruled to be unconstitutional because of those rules that were set in place. So it takes amendments to change those. The Civil War, of course, happens. 13th Amendment ends slavery, but we still experience many issues. So we enter the era of Reconstruction and resegregation. What we're looking at there is a different type of discrimination against African Americans in the Black community, specifically the laws that require segregated facilities. Public facilities have to be segregated. And that enters then Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that you probably did hear about in U.S. history. So as we're looking at this, we had a citizen who was 1/8 African American, and they tried to sit in the white boxcar. Well, the law requires these things. And there's a big difference between having a white only and a colored only. It is law that they have to be segregated. So 1/8 African American, and they were told that they were in the wrong car. Well, the ruling that came from this case was if the facilities were equal, separate was okay. Separate but equal. That's the doctrine that came from Plessy versus Ferguson. But separate was never equal. The facilities were not equal. So when they were classifying them based on that, there was a huge problem that presented itself. And the main focus was in education, schools. And that's where Brown versus Board of Education comes up later. But first, we've got to get there. And that means we look at the 14th Amendment. We've already talked about it with civil liberties, with no state shall deny anybody due process of law. Also, no state shall deny anybody equal protection of the law. So not only do we have selective incorporation with the due process, we now have equal protection within the state for laws as well. Just because of who you are, you can't be treated differently. And that is where these different categories come in. You have many different categories where you can be discriminated against. So equal protection clause really covers all of them. So as they look at this separate but equal doctrine that Plessy set up, how are they going to go about changing it? And the focus, again, was in schools. They felt like that was the best place, the most apparent place to see that there were a lot of separate facilities, but they really were not equal in any way. So they did it in kind of a staggered process. They used a lot of help from the NAACP and pushing them through step by step. So to begin with, let's do number one. Well, this one's pretty easy. If there's a very clearly unequal facility, then it has to be unconstitutional. So if you had a facility that had no heat, no plumbing, and then right down the street was the white school that had the best of the best and the best of everything, Wi-Fi in 1930, then we've got a big problem. So the obvious ways. Then you look more at subtle ways. That's the next step. Take an issue to court when it's a subtle difference, subtly unequal. And as you start to get more support for number one, then you get maybe more support for number two, and then you hit the big one. And this is what actually happened with Brown versus Board. We now entered this one. If you have school segregation, regardless of the facilities, it is automatically unconstitutional. These 1, 2, 3 steps were able to get the Supreme Court on the side of the civil rights, and Brown versus Board of Education happens. So in the segregated school district, the individual had to walk past the white school to get to her colored school. They ruled that this was inherently unconstitutional. Separate is automatically unequal. Therefore, it's unconstitutional. And the ruling, and this is where it's interesting on what the impact of the Supreme Court can do. The ruling said in there that schools must integrate with all deliberate speed. Well, there's a difference between integrate, segregate, and desegregate. So desegregate really just means that there can no longer be laws related to keeping things separate. But the fact of the matter is, this is 1954. It took years and years and years for these schools to desegregate, let alone have integrated schools as well. So it's not always an automatic view that it's just going to be happen. So one of the options that was occurring was there were white areas of town and there were black areas of town. So what you ended up seeing was still a white school and a black school, because the school, the community would say, go to the school that's closest to you. Well, in a lot of cases, that was actually the school that corresponded to your, the original segregation. So the black school or the white school. And that is de facto segregation. I mean, if you look at, this isn't as big of an issue, but if you were to look at the Flint schools 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, they were predominantly black. That is a de facto by reality situation. We no longer have a black only school. Flint schools were not ever black only. They happen to be predominantly black. Some schools in Michigan were heavily or solely white. That wasn't because it was by law. It was more the reality of where people chose to live. And because of that, you look at what happened to suburbs. We had a lot of white flight in northern cities. Detroit, then you see Novi, Birmingham, Farmington Hills balloon because of black families moving to the cities. And that can't really control. You can't tell somebody where they can and can't live. But what they did do is they tried to force busing. So what they would do is, if the white school and the black school were still segregated de facto by reality, meaning that it was all white or all black, not white only or black only, but all white or all black, is they would force the students to go to the other schools. So then you would have a forced integration. What they also try to do is, as opposed to white flight, they tried to force students from other districts to go back into the cities. Now that forced segregation, or forced integration, was much different. And this word down here, you won't be able to see, but it's practice segregation. So that would mean that Novi, I'll use Novi, was a white only school, or Detroit became a black only school. If those two schools practice segregation, then they could be forced to integrate. But schools never really did that after this ruling happened in the North. It was more of an issue in the South, where busing, in one case, was ruled to be constitutional, in others not. So it's not like Owasso students can be forced to go into Flint, and Flint students forced to become into Owasso, because we are not a white only school or a black only school, and Flint is not a white only school or a black only school. So we do not practice segregation. Other issues with African Americans that we've looked at, voting tends to be one of the most talked about. The 24th Amendment, poll taxes, remember that one, that's going to keep coming up. Voting Rights Act, literacy test, there we go. But the Civil Rights Act is huge, many different parts to that. That is the big legislation that we need to focus on. But then also white primaries, Smith versus Allwright. So, the primaries are not related to voting necessarily in terms of who your candidate or who the winner is, but it's who actually gets on the ballot. So if white people were the only ones able to vote in primaries in the South, there were never candidates who supported black individuals, the African American community. So by having white primaries, African Americans were excluded from even picking a nominee. So the nominees that were on the November ballot were never even really included in favor of civil rights extensions to African Americans. So that was ended in 1944 by Smith versus Allwright, saying that there could no longer be white primaries. If there was a primary, everybody would have to be able to vote. So with the Civil Rights Act, the biggest piece of this is there is no more Jim Crow law. You cannot have a white only or a colored only drinking fountain, restaurant, bus station, whatever. It's done. You can't have that. Now there are other parts, voting, schools, using litigation. They can have desegregation. They would give extra money to schools who would desegregate, or they would withhold funds for schools that continue to segregate in the South. And that's really where the focus of Brown versus Board failing was the South, because the North didn't even have school segregation. But then employment, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created to ensure that you weren't treated unfairly because of your race. And then anybody who was receiving federal funds was attached to this as well. So again, the Civil Rights Act, many different pieces went into having this passed, but Jim Crow laws were done. No more public segregation. They had to change. If it was white only, it was no longer constitutional. They had to break it up, and it was open to the public. It was open to everybody. So these all did stem from African American pushes. The NAACP was really there, but it's not just for African Americans. It applied to many other situations. We brought up gender. It applied to gender, but then also other minority groups also were impacted by this. Hispanics, Asian Americans, don't really see the same long-lasting history that we're accustomed to looking at with slavery and then going into Jim Crow, but still huge issues related to the education programs, the language programs, English as a second language, that type of stuff. And then Asian Americans have also been discriminated against at different times. If you were to look at the Chinese, the way that they were treated with the Exclusion Act, then with the railroads, and looking at that, they had that as well. Now, what we're going to move on to is looking at the standard that is used to determine when race can be a factor with discrimination. And it is extremely rare. It just can't happen. This, though, is the one time that racial discrimination has been upheld using this strict standard. So this racial discrimination standard that I'm talking about is called strict scrutiny, which is going to be on the next slide. But the idea is right down here. In order for racial discrimination to be constitutional, it has to be narrowly tailored and have a compelling government interest. So during World War II, Korematsu versus the U.S., Japanese Americans were forced to be relocated to internment camps. And they spent the time there to protect, I guess, the spine, whatever you want to phrase it. And the question then became, was it narrowly tailored, and was there a compelling government interest? Well, narrowly tailored means that it only impacts the individuals who need to be impacted. And it was Japanese Americans. Now, is that narrowly tailored? I don't know how all Japanese Americans would fit this profile, that they would have to be considered enemies and have to go to internment camps. That was the argument that was made, and it was narrowly tailored. Or was it narrowly tailored? And it was considered, yes, to be narrowly tailored, that it did impact more people than it should to get the compelling government interest. And in this case, the compelling government interest would be national security. But the bigger focus, the harder argument to make from the side of the government would have been narrowly tailored, and it didn't impact more people than it would. But right on to strict scrutiny, looking at who it applies to. This is the most difficult standard when looking at discrimination. Race and religion, those are the groups that have to use strict scrutiny. So with strict scrutiny, we'll look at this Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, marriage, interracial marriage. Virginia had banned interracial marriage. And their argument was that this was a compelling government interest because there was a legitimate purpose in preserving racial purity, and that marriage was a state power using the 10th Amendment. But racial purity would mean then looking at biracial children and how the state had a purpose in not having biracial children. So is that a compelling government interest? Is it narrowly tailored? And that is where it became no.
Please call 5490. Janelle Perkins, please call 5490.
Not willing. Okay. So again, that is the standard. Strict scrutiny, racial and religious discrimination, that's when you use strict scrutiny. Women do not fall under strict scrutiny. Sometimes they have, but it's kind of a mix. It's kind of reasonableness, which we talked about with the draft, and then strict scrutiny in other cases. You look at the compelling government interest, narrowly tailored, they kind of use different standards. And this has been a long ongoing development, looking at multiple issues. Seneca Falls, looking at suffrage, and it took years. You look at 1848 and just how long it took for women's suffrage to come about. It actually took an amendment. So 1920, we've already talked about the 19th Amendment, but now women have the right to vote. And the big reason for that is states were unwilling to allow women to vote. Certain states had allowed women to vote well before 1920, but it took an amendment, the 19th Amendment, for it to actually happen. And then we enter other pushes. The feminist movement was a big part of this, looking at the reasonableness standard, and that the difference, the discrimination, the discriminatory practice must be reasonable and not arbitrary. So the examples that we did talk about in class were age limits for driving, drinking, smoking, whatever the case may be. Those would be arbitrary. They aren't reasonable. The statutory rape laws, though, looking at the underage individuals and how they would be treated, are a little bit different. So this is more of a mid-level. The reasonableness is, it has to be reasonable, not arbitrary. And then strict scrutiny, the compelling government interest, narrowly tailored. It's kind of a balance in between there. It's mid-level, kind of varies there. Now, the big push would have completely changed that. This right here, if you read the potential, this was potential. This is not a part of the Constitution, so make sure that you make that distinction. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of sex. That right there would be no discrimination. So if we were to go back, you get rid of reasonable. There is no potential for discrimination. Everybody, every situation would have to be blind of gender discrimination. It would not be allowed. And what that would do then, if we look, this case was a little bit after this amendment was proposed, but women would have to require, or would be required to register for the draft. Rotzker versus Goldberg. Could they be allowed to register men for the draft, but not women? And in the case, they said, yeah, the reason is men tend to be stronger upper body strength on average than women. So because of that, it is mid-level scrutiny, and there must be, that would be then a compelling government interest. So they were able to uphold that requirement of the draft. If that would have been the other direction, if they would have said, no, that doesn't make sense, men and women should both have to register, the ERA maybe would have been passed. But once this happens and says that there are differences, and as such, laws should be different in different situations, it kind of ends the push that the ERA had, and they would have to go differently. Now, taking a look with women's rights still in equality, talking here about right to privacy. Now, these two cases, Griswold in Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is a more of a talked about one, more of a common one, but both of these deal with right to privacy. And why I'm referencing that, and I want you to think about this, these two cases are very popular with the College Board for being on the test looking at right to privacy. So right to privacy would be, when can the government get involved in your personal life? So Griswold versus Connecticut, they had a law that banned birth control. Could a state ban birth control? And what they ruled here was that did violate, and that was a discriminatory practice. So the whole purpose that they looked at was, well, you look at the Third Amendment. You don't have to allow soldiers to come into your house. Your Fourth Amendment, they need a search warrant. Fifth Amendment, you don't have to testify against yourself. And what they ruled was that this was an inferred right to privacy that was referenced in the Bill of Rights, and therefore it was protected by the Constitution, and it would be a discriminatory practice against women for a state to be able to ban birth control. And then Roe v. Wade is the 1970s abortion case. Can a state deny somebody an abortion? And what the Supreme Court ruled was that on a state level, no, with different situations. And this is where the ruling kind of developed in terms of a trimester health pregnancy type response. So does a woman have the right to an abortion? This was how they broke it down. They broke it down by trimesters. In the first trimester, states cannot deny a woman an abortion. Now, what they have done, though, is they've offered up a lot of different laws that require them to do certain things in order to get an abortion, but they can't be denied. In the second, and these are up to the states, but in the first trimester, there can't be any regulations on that in terms of limiting. They might have to go through different actions in order to get it, but it can't be denied. In the second one, they can regulate it and limit it to certain situations in regard to the woman's health. So maybe after the end of the first trimester, it can only be in these situations. And then in the third trimester, all states can ban it entirely. And that's what most states have done, is in the third trimester, it's off the charts for an option, regardless of the situation and reason. But that is how the Supreme Court had broken it down and made these different distinctions on when states can do certain things and when they can make laws and when they can't. So just a few more things related to equal rights. We've talked a lot about equal pay, and we read that article related to fair pay and when is fair pay equal pay. Well, it is a difficult answer or difficult question to answer because there are so many different pieces to it. And with Title VII in the Civil Rights Act, it did target employment. So it was all well and good until Lilly Ledbetter had issues with male employee salaries. She was able to learn about the salaries of some employees who were doing the exact same things as her, males, and she was not getting paid as much. So then that enters the mindset of the government, and they're able to make policies that try to address that issue. And comparable worth is one of those. I mean, if you have this idea that men and women should be paid the same, how do you compare a construction worker to a nurse? Going back to like the traditional gender roles, I guess, for those male-centered fields or female-centered fields that they were referred to as. So how are you able to do that? How are you able to look at that? And the whole basis is to just get men and women to earn the same amount, not necessarily the jobs, but how to get men and women to earn the same amount. And continuing on with that, this is the focus of equal pay, and it's a difficult issue here because I get paid the same as the female teachers who have the same education and the same experience. Same thing with coaching. Varsity boys coaches get paid the same as varsity girls coaches for, let's say, baseball and softball or basketball. They get paid the same. Well, what about college? They receive funding from the government, so they have to provide equal funding. And that's Title IX. Girls who play sports or are involved in band or any other type of extracurricular, you can thank this for that. Title IX allowed the government to force schools to provide these opportunities. So what that kind of changed, or what that changed was when a government institution receives funding, they like a public school, they have to provide these opportunities for men and for women. So again, back to the college though, what I was getting at with that Title IX stuff is the head coach of, let's say, Michigan State for basketball, Tom Izzo, does not get paid the same as the women's coach. So is that fair? Is that comparable worth? I mean, they're performing essentially the same job, and is it okay for Tom Izzo to get paid more? And that is a little bit more of a situational issue than just if you wanted to go back to a high school or something like that. Last thing with this workplace rights with gender discrimination would be sexual harassment. And this is where the EEOC would come in, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're in charge of looking at when sexual harassment is attributed to a situation, and they investigate it. And their job is to really be the person to investigate so somebody doesn't have to be fearful of it. And that's where these different types come in. So intimidation, you have a fear of losing your job because of who you are, male or female. This is not a male to male, male to female, female to male, female to female issue. This is sexual harassment regardless of the situation, regardless of the sexes involved. This is sexual harassment. So quid pro quo would be this for that. You're trading, a date for a promotion or a raise or something like that. In hostile environment, it can just be dirty jokes or something like that, where if somebody feels like it's harassment because it's a sexual joke or something like that, it might be sexual harassment. And that's the conduct that workplaces are not allowed to permit anymore. Okay. As we look at the